Boss Man, right?
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is OutKasted Conversations, Season 2, Episode 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th. And I have a really, really dope guest. This is my friend. This is my sister. You know, I gave her nickname that she had copyrighted. You know what I mean? She still owed me a check. Timothy Ann Burnside, a.k.a. the notorious T.A.B., the notorious Tab, who is a museum specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, pretty much also known as the Black Smithsonian. Tab, how you?
I'm great. How are you, Dr. Bradley?
I mean, you know, I'm cute, so I'm good.
That's true.
So we're just gonna jump into this thing. You have to answer the question to get into the club. How did you become OutKasted?
Through a really old-fashioned medium called music videos on television, right?
Such a relic.
People would like make visual representation of their songs, and they would play on TV all the time on a couple stations. So I grew up in northern Wisconsin, as you know.
East Bubblefuck, Wisconsin.
Yes, north.
North. Oh,
Yeah. We didn't have radio stations that played anything close to OutKast. And so it wasn't until they really hit MTV that I was exposed to them and was like mesmerized, of course, with like, what the hell is this? And then got into it like in terms of like listening and paying attention more when I was in college. And then that love affair has continued now through actual like work and stuff. It's pretty great.
yeah. So I mean, okay. So let's talk about your work. So you are a specialist, and your area of specialty for collecting is what?
More contemporary cultural history, specifically music and performing arts, which there's a lot under that umbrella.
Yeah. So in particular, over the last, I don't know, maybe 5, even a decade, even you've been focusing on African American music. So could you talk to me a little bit about like what that process of collecting for a museum, especially a museum like the Smithsonian, what that entails, and you know how you did it and all that other good stuff?
It's a lot.
Okay.
It's a lot. But yes, so I first started collecting in hip hop specifically in about 2006, when the American History Museum, where I used to work before coming to the new museum, we launched an initiative to recognize hip hop. Which was the first time the Smithsonian did that. And so ever since then, it's been a lot about networking and developing and maintaining relationships with people within the hip hop community or communities all over the country in order to really work collaboratively to bring their objects and then through their objects, their stories to the museum. So it's a lot of back and forth, it's a lot of visits, it's a lot of just sitting down and listening, and that's how I've also been educated in so many of these different areas of hip-hop. It's through the actual practitioners, through the people who have not just created what is hip-hop, but who have been instrumental in continuing it and pushing it forward, to be able to literally sit down with them on multiple occasions and make sure that the work we're doing at the museum accurately reflects their journey, their stories, and that it's really about being an advocate in a way for there to be a space, first of all, for these stories to be told, right. And then figuring out like what are the dope objects we can use to put in exhibitions, to feature online, to use in educational ways, in creative ways that tell multiple stories in one object or through one object.
So that's what I kind of want to talk to you about too, is, the stories behind the object. So of course you can have Jay Dilla's, NPC, right? And you're just like, but I mean like, especially I guess as a literary scholar, cultural scholar, I'm interested in how those stories translate. Because, initially hip hop was for Black and brown working class youth who were frustrated with the life around them. That also transferred down south when, hip hop really hit in the South. So you talked about, being an advocate for these type of stories to be told. I'm curious to hear more about, how do you navigate that process between not necessarily being like a gatekeeper, but being able to reflect these stories accurately so that they don't get lost in translation with the audience that you're trying to, present them to.
Right. And I think a lot of that is that idea of being lost in translation is what has happened to so many different kinds of stories, particularly when you're talking about any kind of Black creative expression, because the gatekeepers, the old school like approaches and methodologies and all of that, it was not inclusive. It was not diverse. The people doing the work were not thinking about the things we're thinking about today in terms of equity and inclusion and making sure that people have access to these spaces. And so that's exactly what we're trying to change with this new museum, of course. And a lot of the work is, like I said, just sitting down and shutting up. Honestly, that's a lot of the work is just being engaged and being present and being dedicated. But fully recognizing that this is not my story to tell necessarily.
Like you're a guest in the space.
Exactly. And that is, there's a difference between, and this is not going to be a diss to scholars. I love my colleagues
who are
the academics in the world. But there's a difference between talking about people and talking about something and writing about it and being an expert on it and going to them and just listening to them and then and documenting and preserving their words and their stories, right? So that's my job is not to just be an expert on something in one particular area or in multiple areas. My job is to educate myself as best I can, knowing that there are only but so many, ways and levels and all of that to what I can understand. But it's about capturing the story with this first person often narrative and creating that primary source. That's what we're doing, right? Like we're using these objects and these collections along with the information we get from the donors themselves, because almost every single artifact, in particularly in the hip hop section, almost every single thing was donated by that person.
Right.
So
or their estate.
Or their estate, exactly. The Dilla equipment, his mother. But you look at Slick Rick's birth certificate, like that is from him personally, and so it is about...
That ain't kind of dangerous though to put your little birth
It's from the UK,
information.
I
don't know, they might try to
we
work
block
that out.
out sensitive information. We have, best practices.
Oh, okay.
But
right.
that's really like a testament to the way that this museum in particular has developed the collections. It is a collective process. And it is a process where we work with communities of people. We aren't just going in, swooping down, and taking all the cool shit and like leaving town.
Right.
We want to engage, and we want to make sure that the stories we're telling are accurate and are coming from a perspective that is not just knowledgeable about it, but steeped in it.
But also, I think that's really important. And I'm like, we've had these conversations, right? It's like, okay, you're a white girl named Timothy entering these hip hop spaces, and and they're like, hold up, wait, what? But I think you kind of nailed it on the head. Is that being able to not only advocate, right? Because you're very much aware of the spaces that you can enter. That somebody like me, if you have a rap artist who isn't familiar with how the semantics of in the hierarchies of, the museum studies and museum curation works, then you can serve as a bridge between the two, right? And I think that's really important with something like hip hop, is because, hip hop was intended for and was created by folks of color. And folks of color want to make sure that folks of color don't get erased.
Right.
And I think that what's really important is that when we have conversations about hip hop, we often talk about the actual production of it, not necessarily the preservation of it. So that's where, curators and hip hop journalists and writers kind of come into that conversation. So you mentioned the Slick Rick, birth certificate. You talked about Jay Dilla's, his machine work, right? Why we're here. I want to know about how the hell did you get the wig, the infamous silver wig of a certain Mr. Benjamin, and also Big Boy's Atlanta hat?
Well, just like we do with every collection, and that is engaging with the donors. First you have to so one of the things that is really interesting about a lot of the conversations about this work is that the word curator is thrown out so many different places now, and it is often understood to just, you just need to have a knowledge base, be an expert, and you can curate something, which is part of the job, right? But what people don't see is all of the work that so many other people do leading up to that object being in a case, and that, you know, you've got, maybe if you're lucky, you get 75 words to tell a story. Right. If you're really lucky, you get 125, but usually you get about 50 or 75 words to capture the story of OutKast, for example.
So you're doing tweets before tweets were even a thing.
We were doing.
Okay.
Yes. How about that?
This is offline tweeting.
Offline tweeting.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's good. But so the way that we collect is, again, to engage with communities of people, to network and navigate those spaces. And that is, like you said, been a very interesting and sometimes complex situation for me with navigating through different spaces in hip hop. Thankfully, there are a number of moments where, you know, introductions are made and things move forward, and it's a beautiful thing. So
and sometimes it's multiple introductions.
Multiple
Right?
introductions.
Like, who? Wait, what?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
But, you know, there are these quiet moments where you're sitting with these potential donors and, you know, just literally talking about their life, talking about their legacy. And often folks in hip hop or more contemporary kind of cultural spaces who are still very active in those spaces, are not thinking legacy. They're not thinking like, okay, because I'm done. Like it's time for me to go and my stuff will be in a museum. Like,
because it feels like you're trying to push them out.
Right. Which is not the case. We want to celebrate them while they're here. Because there's absolutely no reason why we cannot do that, and why we shouldn't do it. So, you know, talking with Dre, talking with Big Boy, talking with just like them one-on-one as individuals, and understanding what it is that is important to them, that be part of that legacy and that documentation from their perspective. It's not, there's a kind of dual approach to the collecting work. Whereas, of course, we can have our wish lists where we're like, we want this, and we want this, we want this. And like with Dilla, it was like the MPC, that's the Holy Grail. But sometimes you sit down with people and you start looking at their collection and you start talking to them, and the most amazing things come out as being what you really want that you would have never known to ask for.
Give me an example, if you can.
Well, there are a number of them throughout the museum. And you know, there are some that are not quite finalized in the process yet that I cannot discuss.
Well, let me ask this, since you all under the fifth and not letting me be great. The Mothership.
The Mothership
was that on the Holy Grail list? Because
there are and there are a lot of there are also object types. You know, we wanted certain, or even just to start going through different genres of music or different, in sports, the same kind of thing. Like, we want to represent these kinds of stories, and then who is available to us to collect from, because the thing about in the music exhibition in particular is it's not a Hall of Fame approach. There's no it's not just about awards and, moments of accomplishment and achievement. It's about all of the ways that the stories we're presenting in that exhibition connect throughout the rest of the museum. And so you may have a feature on OutKast or on Dinah Washington or, the En Vogue dresses from the music video. But those individuals or groups are really just being used to represent the much larger narrative. So if we're talking about contemporary rhythm and blues, and we're talking about connections to vocal harmonization of girl groups and that kind of trajectory, En Vogue is a great way to open that conversation. So if we're talking about Southern hip hop, for example, OutKast is a great way to open that door. And so it's not just about that individual or that group. It is about a lot more, but we have to put something in the case, and there has to be a way to engage with our audiences. And so to feature different individuals or different stories through those objects is how we can hopefully start to get people to think about those connections. So as they're walking through hip-hop and they're walking through whatever other genre sections in musical Crossroads, they're thinking about the power of place and the Bronx section in that exhibition, or they're thinking about the boombox downstairs in the 68 gallery. They're thinking about, Do the Right Thing. And so there are ways where we are hopefully connecting the dots and making those, through lines very clear to all of our visitors. So that doesn't really answer your question. You just want to
No,
know.
it really does.
Like,
I mean, I want to know, was there like a phone call? Was there like, are we going to meet for,
Yep.
a tea or
well,
something?
it's usually like, here's so-and-so, meet so-and-so.
Okay.
And then you start to like and then the next thing you know, you're literally just texting with somebody about, hey, I'll come by the house tomorrow and we'll talk about the lyric books or whatever.
Dope.
And then there you are. And so you talk about, and that's one of the things too, is like making sure that you're noting all the stories that they're telling. Because there are ways that the memories are triggered when stuff is in front of you. And so we have to capture those moments as best we can, because that might be a fleeting opportunity. That might be like a literally once in a lifetime opportunity to capture a story, as they're flipping through pages of lyrics they haven't looked at in 20 years, and they start talking about what it was like and what inspired that particular, verse or that particular storyline in the song or whatever. And oftentimes they're based on real life events. And that starts to then open up conversations about the actual time that they were experiencing outside of creating music or writing lyrics, or outside of hip hop, but like real life shit. Nice. And that connects then to all of the other stories that we're telling throughout the museum.
So I think you were talking about how the artifacts themselves help to tell a particular story about place. One of the things I found interesting, of the many times I've been to the museum, I'm one of them.
Slight flex.
Is that I just love the way it's set up. So it's like when you come into the museum, you start on the bottom floor, and the bottom floor is like early American history, slavery, stuff like that.
2008.
Yeah, and I'm just like, it's so quiet down there, right? And you have particular artifacts of a historical South that was horrifying, terrorizing to Black folks. And then you come up to like these other floors and you have like the civil rights movement, and you have footage of the buses and all of these. And then you finally get to like the music level.
It's the very top of the building.
And it's like, it's just so vibrant, and folks are having a good time. Like I brought my daughter, and she thought she was a crate digger, because she was like, I know all of these things.
Because you can do that.
Yeah, and I'm like, look, girl, you don't know nothing. And then there was like a karaoke with all the older folks singing like OutKast and singing like, and then the young folks just looking at us like, what are y'all doing? And we're like, we are enjoying the moment.
Please let us have this.
Please let us have this. Yeah. As a Southerner, I was really interested in the way that the museum articulates what the South does for folks, particularly along the lines of race and class. And I think that OutKast is almost like the end of the rainbow type thing. It's like you have all of these traumatic experiences that are documented in this very powerful way. And then you end with like hip hop.
Right.
And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how region is so significant in understanding the Black musical Crossroads exhibit, because the South is very much present.
Absolutely.
But it's in not necessarily older genres, but in different decades, and then you have OutKast, and then it's kind of like, oh man, where do we go? Where do we go from here? So I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts about, how do we think about the museum as a place to update our ideas about what music can do for folks in the South?
Well, that was something we were very thoughtful about when planning the exhibition, was that it had to be organized some way. And so genre was the way to do that. And then within each genre, you're right, there are stories that represent different regions, that span different, time periods. So it's not a kind of linear path at all in the exhibition, like different themes and places, and, that pops up everywhere. We initially, actually, speaking of place, one of the things we wanted to do was have a map of the country and have it be an interactive, where you're actually able to understand the movement of music and the kind of sonic migration around the country, and be able to connect it to other events and actual, in history. Of course, that was back when we had 13,000 square feet and we ended up with 6. So, you got to make some cuts. But that whole idea, that whole kind of notion of the importance of region was incredibly, that was at the top of our list. And so to be able to make those connections, like you said, like you may read about the South in unexpected places in different genres. And you after hopefully you've come through the rest of the museum, you're also thinking about, you know, what you have just learned or experienced in relation to that particular place. And so the placement of the music in the place, through in that kind of storyline, you're right, is it because the musical Crossroads exhibition is very celebratory and it is very, you know, uplifting, but it's also real heavy in a lot of ways and in a lot of places. You know, we have a whole section that looks at, you know, artists as activists. There's a through line of solidarity and protest. You know, we look in the very beginning of the exhibition, we're looking at Odetta, you know, and we're talking about like how these different individuals are navigating those different regions and also navigating their own sonic space.
Yes.
And not always existing in just one.
Or collapsing those boundaries that are, oh, you're from the South, you're only supposed to do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And even when you look at different genres, you know, the expectations of Black artists in rock and roll, for example.
True.
Let alone Southern, you know, artists who are trying to do black and roll or rock and roll, or even, you know, from the West Coast. So there are different ways where, again, we're using these objects to really just channel all of that energy. And all of those stories, and to be able to kind of, you're right, like I hadn't thought about it that way, but like if you're thinking about like the Southern journey through the museum, you know, you come up to the exhibition and look at music, and you're literally hearing OutKast in that record store space. You know, they're in multiple places throughout. You know, we've got the record Aquemini in the crates. You get to hear Miss Jackson up on the thing. They're performing live in, I think it's Germany, in the immersive space in the very center.
Right,
they're doing Bombs Over Baghdad. And then, of course, the objects on display. So, and to circle back to your question, that connects very much to the Atlanta hat because, you know, we all know Big Boy does not represent Atlanta.
Facts.
Ever. So that was an important thing to him, was to kind of that representation, and it's authentic. And I think that is something that, you know, is hard to capture with a group like OutKast in such a limited space, is this like proud, so completely 100% authentically Southern with no kind of hesitation ever at all. You know, to just kind of capture that with a few artifacts is challenging. So I hope we're able to do a lot more in different ways that are outside of the physical space of just that exhibition, and be able to really take advantage of all the marvels of technology these days.
Yeah, when it works.
When it works, yeah, because you're right, like your conversations about not just the sonic identity, but their visual identity is so crucial to understanding the whole collective, So
I guess that leads to, you know, my last question for you, which is where do museums like the NMAAHC, I can't even do the acronym, the Black Smithsonian, where do we go from there in terms of how we think about, how we preserve and understand the significance of Black music, particularly in this very tumultuous moment of American history, which isn't anything new, but it's still very much a part, you know, music is still very much a part of how we understand what's going on. So, you know, as somebody who still collects in this area, and as, you know, thinking forward, obviously there are thousands of artifacts that the public hasn't even seen yet. But I'm curious about, you know, how do you evolve something like the Black Musical Crossroads exhibit to reflect that continued lineage that you are already presenting with the music that you already have on display?
Yeah, we're always collecting. That's the first part of it. We're always collecting, and we're always looking for ways to broaden the conversations we have through the collections. And so we're adding to that in through more contemporary lenses, of course, making those connections between like the theme of solidarity and protest, like that is crucial, especially now. But it's also this interesting kind of narrative where it's like there's the side of music that is the music that is being created in reaction to something, or in protest of, or that is inspired by, right? And then that's coming from a place from the artist's perspective, the commentary within hip hop, for example, and like all of those things. But then there's also the music that people are using in the moments of protest that have absolutely nothing to do with protest music.
Right.
And so how are different songs and becoming anthems in different spaces, in different moments, that on the surface level, were not written to be or didn't come out of a place of protest necessarily, but are being adopted by different movements, by different even parts of the country. And so how are we able to kind of listen to that? Because scholarship is often quick to dismiss music that isn't like the heavy, the you know what I mean? Like if you can't get into it and dissect it and whatever.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's not important to people in those moments. Right. And so how are we balancing that and making sure that we're not losing that whole other side of it? Because what's moving people on the streets, you know, in Baltimore or Ferguson or wherever is not "We Shall Overcome." You know, that is not what's happening. And so, but what are they listening to? What are people literally using to stay awake and stand up and keep moving while they're in those moments? And it's not what we always expect it to be. So making sure we're always capturing the consumer side of things, the actual like use of music and interpretation of, and how it becomes so ingrained in our everyday life, as well as, of course, celebrating the people who are creating it, but not necessarily. We kind of intentionally blur a lot of those lines, I guess. Right. And so looking forward, like I say this all the time, like who are the next people carrying those torches? Who is the next Bernice Johnson Reagan? Who is the next person to not just do what they did, but push it in different directions, do different things, be daring, and you know, contribute in their own unique way. And so we kind of have to have our ear on all of that, literally, and making sure that we're not devaluing more contemporary stories just because they're new and the people who are doing it are young, because that's not fair to them. And we want to make sure that we're engaging on all different levels.
Yeah, and I think that the museum has done a good job of that so far, you know, especially the music section. So shout out to DeJuan Reese. Dr. DeJuan Reese, we see you. Thank you for being so dope. But Tab, thank you for coming to come and kick it and tell us about, you know, the whole curatorial
world
process. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is OutKasted Conversations. We'll see y'all next time. Y'all be easy.